first time doing it in this format, which I'm excited about. Usually, John and I just chat with one another and then share it with everyone. But this is going to be a little bit more interactive, and we want to hear from the folks joining us. So you can also, as we're talking, just pop questions in your in the chat box, and we can read those out as well if you'd prefer to do that rather than asking the question. But I think what we're going to do for today is I spoke about, for those who read our the Friday email that I sent out and post to Substack. I wrote this week about kind of how we are in a moment of rupture and how a moment of rupture requires something new and more than just harsh words. And then John replied to my email, as he oftentimes does, and sometimes he agrees with my emails and sometimes he disagrees with my emails, and I like hearing from him on both things. And this time I think I would say we had our maybe our spiciest exchange. I say that with love, of course. And what I said was, well, let's save the good stuff for the rest of the people. Let's not do all the good stuff here on email. So how we're going to do the conversation, because this issue of West Bank annexation is kind of reaching new heights, and we're seeing new levels of just brazen annexation attempts of the West Bank. And as I talked about in the piece, and as our statement mentioned, we're no longer talking just about Area C, which is the area that is fully under Israeli military and civil control. We're also talking about changes to areas A and B. And so that is really a real difference, a real shift in Israeli policy. It's a real emboldened policy towards annexation. And so we're going to talk, I think, a little bit more about that and debate between the two of us, I think, what we think needs to be done, because I think we have some differing opinions. But as we do so, we also really want to hear from you all. You may agree with one of us more than the other. You may agree with neither. You may agree with both, or you may have some questions for us. So please do feel free, as we're chatting, like, put something in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function if you want to contribute, and we can take you off of mute and you can add to what we're talking about. But this really is just a way for us to talk through these issues. Or you may have some questions, you may want something clarified, and we're happy to do that as well. And then we'll see how the time goes. We may also want to touch on Iran. We may want to touch on the Board of Peace. I think, John, you just did an interview for CTV on the Board of Peace.
CBC.
CBC, Board of Peace. We'll send that out in the email as well. So, we can kind of go in any direction. I think we're going to give ourselves just about an hour for this conversation, which we hope involves a lot of participation from you all as well. And going to keep it really casual and see how it goes. So let's start off by talking about what's happening in the occupied West Bank right now, and why what is happening right now is considered such an escalation and so dangerous. So, John, do you wanna talk about that a bit?
Sure. Well, you mentioned that there has been legislation passed in Israel, which, for really the first time, gives Israel the power to begin to acquire land in areas A and B, which is a major change because up until now, I think Israel has tried to live somewhere between. We're not really occupying the land, and we're not really taking control of it. Yes, there are settlers, but of course, we're going to make a deal in the end, and we're going to swap where the settlers are, and we're going to give the Palestinians land. But the new reality is that this government, and especially Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the two messianic nationalistic ministers in the government, who really control the West Bank in many ways, because Bezalel Smotrich, in addition to being finance minister, has special responsibilities in the Ministry of Defense. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, controls public security. So you've got defense, you've got public security, and you've got in a sense, control over the West Bank, built into two of the most right-wing ministers that the government of Israel has ever seen. Now, in addition to these legal changes, you have both ministers, but especially Smotrich, saying that the reason these changes have been brought in is because we want to ensure that a Palestinian state will never exist. So we have the government of Israel, senior ministers, essentially saying that I don't really care what you Western governments say. I don't really care that you may or may not have recognized a Palestinian state. I don't care whether you think that two states for two peoples is the only way to move forward in a land where there are 7.5 million Jews and 7.5 million Arabs. We have basically determined that we are not going to have a Palestinian state. We're not talking about what's going to happen to all those Palestinians, whether we're just going to take control and have them as second or third class citizens, or we're going to expel them. But we are going to prevent self-determination of the Palestinians. Now, there's, of course, no talk about Gaza at this point. Gaza's gone relatively quiet. But I should mention that while the Rafah crossing is open and more humanitarian assistance is coming in, very, very few injured Palestinians are getting out of Rafah at this time. 50 people a day is the last that I had heard. There are thousands and thousands of injured children in Gaza, not just children, but children and others who need to get out, who would be able to receive treatment in Jordan, in other Arab countries, in Europe, in Egypt, etc. But there is restrictions on the number that can come out, and there are certainly restrictions on the numbers that can come in. So we've got two situations of real concern. And of course, we're not talking about whether or not there'll be an independent commission of inquiry in Israel for October 7 and the war that followed, and challenges to the independence of the judiciary. Those are other issues. The exemption of Haredim, we're not going to be talking about that. And of course, the latest issue that we're not going to be talking about is the fact that they're trying to pass a law contrary to a law that completely contrary to a law that Bibi had promised years ago. They're trying to pass a law that would prevent any prayer at the wall, at the Western Wall, by women or I guess non-Orthodox Jews. Um, uh, so mostly women, I guess. So that's that. We've kind of set the scene for why we're both very concerned about the West Bank. And then we had this conversation following Maytal's very interesting comment on Tom Friedman's piece in the New York Times, which many people read and thought was great. And I think we all thought it was great. But what Maytal felt was, great, Tom, you're talking, but we've got to begin acting. Talking is not enough. Criticizing is not enough. We, advocacy groups like JSpace and J Street and governments have to start acting. And that's where we had our little difference. So let me turn it back to you. You can explain our difference, or you can talk about your side, and I'll talk about
Sure,
my side.
sure. So, yes, and I think, and let me just add too and say that it's not just about, um, okay, enough talk, we need action. It's that actually, that my theory, I guess, is that every time that there's, this kind of like hand wringing through op-eds or articles by, the usual suspects, the Tom Friedmans and whoever else, but then nothing happens, it almost feels like it does the reverse, where it emboldens the Netanyahu government because they're like, they're going to say all these harsh words, but no one's actually going to stop us. And I think that was something that Smotrich even said quite a few months ago at some, I can't remember, some one of the settlement council meetings where he said, like, we keep doing this because they keep letting us get away with it. Like they know that that's what's happening, right? So I actually think that we're at a point where it's actually dangerous to just be like, if you're going to keep saying like, I'm going to criticize, but then I'm not going to do anything, I think that it actually does the opposite, where it really emboldens some of these folks who are, that is what they're like, they don't care. They do want to poke the US in the eye, or they do want to poke their critics in the eye, right? Like they're not even trying to live up to some sort of like, they've dropped the facade of like, no, but this is liberal and democratic and et cetera, et cetera. They're saying, no, it's not. And we don't want it to be. We want it to be theocratic and we want to be the messianics in charge. And they're like, come at me, challenge me. And then we've got, a lot of pundits and critics who challenge them with words only. But I think where you and so that's, I think that that's one thing that frustrates me, that even though I agree with the article, and I had someone who wrote me back and replied and was like, but I thought the article was good because it says all these things that you agree with. I'm like, yeah, that's the point. It's saying all the things that we agree with, but then it's not saying like, okay, so what? Now what do we do? So where you, so then the question is, and this is where you and I differed, is now we're also saying, okay, words aren't enough, there needs to be action. And then you're saying the action that you're calling for is not enough, there needs to be more action.
I'm saying that the action that Maytal and JSpace is calling for is not enough. So why don't you set out what JSpace
Sure.
is advocating,
Yeah.
which of course I agree with. I'm just saying not enough.
Right. So, so to talk about some of the policies, and we're actually going to send out a petition for folks to email their MP about some of these issues as well. We'll send it out tomorrow along with this recording. But so we want to see, so we've seen sanctions, we talked about this already. We've seen sanctions on not only individual violent settlers, but on settler organizations and on ministers that aid and abet settler activity, right? We would like to also see a ban on trade with illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And we also want to see sanctions on companies, individual, like private contractors that build, that are contracted to build, like housing and infrastructure in these Israeli settlements. And our focus, and this is, I guess, a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, but I think it's important to talk about that, like our focus at JSpace, we do still bill ourselves as a pro-peace, pro-Israel, pro-democracy organization. Our issue is not with Israel proper within the Green Line. In fact, we value that relationship. I think a lot of folks know I am a dual Canadian Israeli citizen. Israel is very important to me. Israel is important to a lot of our supporters. This is kind of one of the things that I think puts us in this mushy middle between our kind of more right-wing establishment organizations and the anti-Zionist organizations, that we still, advocate for a two-state solution. We still care about the state of Israel. We still consider ourselves pro-Israel and Zionist. But, we do take these more critical stances. So it's very important for us as an organization to really differentiate between the occupied territories and what we see as illegal, and what Canada, by the way, Canada's foreign policy also sees as illegal, is settlements, Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, and Israel proper, Israel within the Green Line. So we keep our asks for sanctions and for kind of punitive measures to be focused on activity in the occupied territories, not Israel within the Green Line, not only because that's our stance as an organization, but also because my fear is that when we start pushing for sanctions on Israel proper, first of all, it becomes way too easy to kind of paint us as an anti-Israel or anti-Zionist organization, which I think loses us a lot of credibility within our Jewish community, where we know that even if the majority of Jews, or a large plurality of Jews, don't necessarily consider themselves Zionist, we know that only about 1%, if not less than that, actively consider themselves anti-Zionist. And we know that like 85% say that they still believe that Israel has the right to exist as a Jewish state. So I think it puts us way offside from where our community is. And I think that sanctions on Israel as a whole would also create a rally around the flag effect in Israel, where sanctions would hurt regular Israeli citizens. It would actually paradoxically make them feel closer to the government in power. And I don't think that it would actually do any, I think that there would be more harm than good in sanctions that extend beyond the occupied territories. So that's kind of, that's how I feel. That's a position that JSpace takes. That's kind of the strategic position that we're in, and that's why we call for the things that we do. But John, why don't you share kind of what you tell me what you think about that?
Sure. So I start from the same place that Maytal does. Support for Israel as a state, support for it living in peace and security. And of course, you didn't say it, but we also support self-determination for the
Of course.
Palestinian people. That's a given. Um, um, I guess I also go back to a time when I was the ambassador, and there were about 250,000 settlers, maybe even more, but that's the number that I remember. There are now 750,000 settlers. Now, many of them are still in the major settlement blocks, which are supposed to be a part of the swap, where Israel would keep the major settlement blocks and there would be a swap for the Palestinians. But we've now got, let's say, 250,000 settlers who are really probably illegal even under Israeli law, or a good percentage of them are. And that's making the idea of two states ever more difficult. The recent legislation and the recent talk of the ministers, as I said, makes it clear that there is no interest in this government in two states. Um, I was very pleased when the Canadian government, the new Canadian government, the Carney government, began shortly after taking power with a joint statement with the French and the Brits, the Australians, and a few others, in which they criticized the settlement expansion and expressed concern, of course, about what was happening in Gaza, called for a ceasefire, etc. Then there was a second declaration with a slightly different group in which they made absolutely clear their unhappiness with the settler violence, the expansion, and again called for a ceasefire. Then you will recall a number of Western governments recognized a Palestinian state. And they did so because they were increasingly concerned that if the settlement expansion continued, like the announcement of E1, which will essentially, if it comes to fruition, divide the West Bank in half. This was even before the new legislation. If that settlement expansion continues, the idea of two states could disappear. And those Western governments wanted to make it clear to the Palestinians, but I think actually more importantly to the Israelis, that they considered those two states essential to stability, to fairness, to equity, to self-determination, and peace and security for both peoples. Well, since then, we have seen continued expansion. E1 was something that governments had opposed for 10 years and had successfully opposed it, but it is going ahead. The new legislation is going ahead. And from my perspective, and as Maytal said, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir not only recognize that governments have taken some action, but have not taken serious action. In fact, Western governments have not taken serious action since I was ambassador from 2006 to 2010. They have been mouthing two states. They continue to argue for it. We all understand why. We all understand that we, as when I say Maytal and I and progressive Jews in Canada and elsewhere, we understand that Israel will only be able to live in peace and security if there are two states, rather than occupying 5.2 million people for another 60 years and inevitably having another October 7. So my position is it's time to do something meaningful. And trying to stop people in the West Bank by putting sanctions on them has clearly not worked. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich couldn't give a damn whether they come to Canada or not. And those settlers, those violent settlers who are killing Palestinians, who are burning their homes, who are burning their cars, who are forcing them off their land, also could not care about sanctions in the West Bank. And I tend to agree with Maytel that there's a problem with putting, and now when I say sanctions on Israel, I'm not talking about Canada alone putting sanctions on Israel. Our trade with Israel is not sufficient to move them or to have Israelis consider the implications of sanctions. But the EU is their largest trading partner, larger than the United States. And apart from Slovakia and Hungary, there are a number of countries in the EU, let's say Slovakia, Hungary, and Germany, a number of countries in the EU that would like to consider suspending their trade agreement. I don't think anybody wants to end it, but they want to suspend it. And I think that is the kind of action that we've now come to. We are facing violent action in the West Bank. We're facing ministers, including the prime minister, who do not want to see a state. And we are seeing actions that could, if they continue, really harm the possibility of two states going forward. So I think that the West, it's time for the West. Now, I agree that this is going to hurt liberal academics. This is going to hurt dancers and musicians. They're already being sanctioned, as you know, around the world. And that's extremely unfortunate. And frankly, it was unfortunate in South Africa because there were a lot of people in South Africa who opposed apartheid, a lot of Jews in South Africa who opposed apartheid. But I think they actually welcomed the sanctions because they saw it as the only way to perhaps move the government. Now, if the EU were to suspend their trade agreement and we were to suspend our trade agreement, would that, and Australia, New Zealand, etc., would that move the government? I can't guarantee it. I don't know. But it might send a signal to Israelis. They could go one of two ways. They could rally around the flag and say, the world hates us, see, or they could say, the West is finally getting serious about this, and our pariah state, notwithstanding the visit of Narendra Modi or relations with countries that want to buy Israel's arms, our pariah state is beginning to concern us greatly, because not only are there sanctions in the West Bank, but we are going to feel trade sanctions within Israel, and that's going to have an impact. And maybe we should reconsider voting for Bibi Netanyahu, who has brought this on. Maybe we should reconsider voting for a coalition that has brought this on. Waking in people in Israel up that what's happening in the West Bank and in Gaza is not removed from them. It's part of their reality, whether they wish it or not. So, I mean, I'll end there, but I can't believe that Western leaders who, within this year, went as far as to recognize a Palestinian state because they were concerned, have since then essentially done nothing, even though Israel is taking moves now that are more far-reaching than they've ever taken before. And I will feel bad about the liberals in Israel and the protesters who oppose this government with all of their feeling. And I understand that Israelis, like good friends of mine and my sister and my nephews and my nieces in Israel, wouldn't be happy about this. But I think the West has to stand up and do something. And there aren't that many tools, and trade is one of the tools that will actually work.
So I'd love, thank you for that, and I'd love to hear. I think we want to hear from folks joining us as well. If we can kind of open up the conversation, but I do just want to say, I think like where I hear what you're saying, and when you say like, okay, so it could go one of two ways, but I think like it's gonna go the way of, I do feel like it's gonna backfire on Western governments, because I feel like right now, I mean, you just sent me that advertisement. What was that from? The advertisement that all those like past Israeli security officials had signed on, and they used the word, I mean, it was in Hebrew, but they used the word, they were condemning what's happening in the West Bank, and they used the word pogroms. And I saw like Dan Meridor, who spoke at our conference. I saw that he was signed on it. That's a big deal. He's a, you know, longtime Likudnik, or was. Um, and
This was
yeah,
an
can you talk about what that was?
advertisement in an Israeli newspaper in Hebrew, signed by a lot of former security people, including Dan Meridor, minister, and other
Okay,
ministers,
good.
which we can send to you, which essentially, yes, criticizes this in the strongest of terms.
It calls it, yeah, the pogroms in the occupied West Bank are a war crime, is how it translates into English. So they use pogrom and war crime.
And you'll remember that Dan Meridor was reluctant to use the word war crime
Yes,
about Gaza
yes,
when he was at the JSpace conference, and he's
yes.
now describing what's going on there. And so, yes, I know, I agree with you. There is a risk. There's definitely a risk. It could go the other way. But I think, and I should say, I also understand Maytal's real concern that she has a flock. She has a group of people who support JSpace, and some of them would be offended by this. And I understand why, as the head of JSpace, she's concerned about that and should be concerned about that. But I am also concerned about what the reality is going forward and where Israel is going to be at if this government gets away with what it intends to get away with, and God forbid should be reelected. I see we have a
I see. Yeah,
question.
we have some questions. So let's. I'm not going to say the rest of what I was going to say. I want to hear from other folks, and then maybe I'll add in if we have time. But I see Dr. Weisfeld. You had your hand up first, so you can take yourself off mute, and then we'll go to Donald Schwartz afterwards. Are you able to unmute there?
It works now.
Yeah, you got it.
We hear you.
Thank you. I'm sort of a new person here in the JSpace arena. Um, and I am originally from a differing political movement, which is the Jewish Bund, because my mother from the Warsaw Ghetto was a Bundist and taught me that. So, what we have in common, I believe, is that we both seek to achieve a Jewish national liberation movement, which is basically revolutionary in terms of the Western concept and imposition of the nation state and, in effect, a Christian nation states. So, I was a bit surprised to hear Maytal refer to Israel as a Jewish nation state, which I think is just sort of a sort of a not necessarily an ideological position, but I think that it is a wording which is problematic because, as we all know, 20% of the Israeli citizen population is Palestinian Arab, not Jewish. So you are in effect setting up a contradiction in that state as such by referring to it as a Jewish nation state, which is only a law that was passed by the Knesset at one point, which is not necessarily um, in conformity, with the Declaration of Independence, even, which is a different kind of a document. And so I wanted to point that out, and not necessarily as a criticism, but as a note as to the um, default position that is taking in reference to Israel. Um, I'm sort of interested in dialoguing with JSpace now, which up until now I haven't been, because I assumed that there would be, uh, less sympathy for the plight of the Palestinians than evidently there is presently. And also, I've been reading this book, Einstein on Zionism, and I find that his um, position is similar to that of a JSpace up until the point of the Biltmore Conference, in which the state was proclaimed as the principal aim of the Zionist movement. And that was where the problems began. And that's why I refer to the comment about that Israel's a Jewish nation state as being problematic in and of itself. I think that what is meant is that Israel is a democratic state with a majority Jewish population. Yes, I recognize that. But there is nonetheless a substantial minority population, and we have to consider the Palestinian refugee population, which is rather substantial and can number, on various estimations, from 5 to 8 million people, which also contradicts the definition of Israel as a Jewish nation state, because it uh, uh, negates, any possibility of Palestinians who were residents there previously before the Nakba to be able to return to their lives and properties. So I just wanted to point that out.
So
Um,
yeah, so let me yeah, so let's pause there for a second. Let me just respond to that, just to clarify a few things. First of all, I'm really happy that you're new and interested in having, being in dialogue with us, and that your background is as it is. I think one of the things that I love the most about our folks at JSpace is that we do have folks who are anti-Zionist, Bundist, believe in a one state outcome, but who say, like, they agree with all of our policies or some of our policies, our interest in some of our policies, and they stick around as a result. And we have that also kind of to the political right of us as well. So these are the most interesting conversations to me. I don't want to get, I think that actually, if you want to email me afterwards and we can have a longer conversation about it, I'm super interested to talk about that. I won't get into it too much, but I just do want to mention a couple things. The difference between Israel's Declaration of Independence and how it talks about itself as a Jewish state versus the nation state law that you reference is that when we talk about Declaration of Independence, we're talking about a declaration that is a Jewish state with equal rights for all of its citizens. And I do believe that that can be accomplished, because what I'm talking about in a Jewish state, I'm not using the kind of like Western Christian ideals of Jewish in that it is only a religion when I say a Jewish state. What I mean when I say a Jewish state is I mean Jews as a nation, Jews as a people, Jews as a culture, and that absolutely can coexist and live with all of the issues that you're referencing, up until and including what will come of right of return for Palestinian refugees, but definitely for rights of minorities, be it Palestinian citizens of Israel, asylum seekers, refugees, etc. Because what I'm talking about when I say Jewish state and how I think about us as Jews is not only as a religion, and not even first and foremost as a religion, but as a nation and as a culture. And that is where our claim to sovereignty comes from, is that the Jews are a nation. Now, what I think is missing when we talk about that is, I would say, and I hear it a little bit in your question, I hear it often when I have these conversations with folks, especially those kind of more to the left of us. Um, is that we do need to have a bigger conversation about when we say Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, what we mean by that. Because I think that it is inherent to a lot of, let's say, liberal Zionists that we are not talking about a Jewish theocratic state that is ruled by halacha. We are talking about everyone assumes that we're all using the same language as a nation of Jews. But then we do have to differentiate between what happens when laws are passed in that country that favor Jews as a religion, as opposed to a state that is for Jews as a nation, which therefore then does not have to exclude others in the same way that I can, not in the same way, but in a similar way that someone who is not French of origin can still live in France and have equal rights. So just to clarify my position, when I say that we are for a Jewish state, I am not talking about a Jewish state as it is defined in the nation state law. I am talking about a Jewish state as it is not as well defined, but probably needs to be in the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, and I would just add that we at JSpace consider that the 20% or the 22% of Arab Israelis deserve to have equal rights within Israel. Obviously, the problem will eventually come if and when, and it won't be during any of our lifetimes, when the 22% becomes 51%. But, as with the Christian evangelicals who support Israel until the rupture, let's just make sure that all Arab Israelis have equal rights, have equal financing for their schools, have equal permitting rights for their homes, and are fully integrated as the doctors and pharmacists and nurses are. All of them should be. And as we discussed in one of our most recent conversations, the crime that is currently infecting the triangle where a majority of Arab Israelis live has to be dealt with, should be being dealt with, and so that they can live peacefully, etc. But thank you also. It's great to have you as part of the conversation.
And we do have some more questions. So if you do have more, we're pretty accessible people. So if you have more thoughts on that, definitely we can have a conversation after this meeting. But I want to go to Donald and then I want to go to Joey. So Donald, if you want to unmute yourself.
First, Maytal and Jon, thank you for providing us with the double context that provides us with a framework within which we can have this discussion. Both the Israeli occupied territory context and then the context of your discussion within JSpace over what should be our changes. So a preliminary. I have a very simple question, and I think it's primarily directed towards you, Jon, but Maytal, you may also have some response. You identified two targets for action, the Canadian government and the Israeli government or movement, whatever. There's a third one, though, that I think would significantly increase credibility and opportunity. That is a blockage in any type of action that might be advocated, and that is the established Jewish community. I think that JSpace, along with the other progressive organizations that are involved in this, would have much more credibility if we could do something about the position of CEJA. I don't read their stuff very much. I don't know whether they have changed their positions very much in response to what has been happening recently. But it would seem to me that CEJA is a key to understanding both the Canadian government position and the extent to which progressive organizations might be able to move ahead with real action. So my question basically is, what do you know about CEJA's positions? Have they changed at all? And am I just talking in a naive or utopian way about changing their position?
I think we're both going to have something to say about this, but you start, John.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I wouldn't call your position naive. It's not, and it's a valid question. But my take is no, CEJA has not changed its position one iota. CEJA did not criticize the threats to the independence of the judiciary when even reform rabbis came out on the street. And of course, we know what was happening in Israel. CEJA never spoke a word about what was happening in Gaza, and CEJA has not said a word about what's happening in the West Bank. They, unless they want to support Israel, they say no criticism of it, and they tend to focus their efforts on anti-Semitism. So I think and I'll let Maytal speak for herself, but I think what JSpace is trying to do is more advocate for the in front of the Canadian government to try and adopt policies that we think are important vis-a-vis the criticisms. I was just saying to Maytel before, I had given a speech in Mexico, and one of the people said, "Well, why don't you ever talk about the good things about Israel, about about the protests and about the fact that civil society stepped up and helped the Israeli families that were attacked and helped the Israeli families that were evacuated, the 60,000." And I said, you're absolutely right, but we here at JSpace, we're an advocacy organization. We're not sort of Hasbara. We're not here to talk about the wonderful things about Israel, and there are many, but we're here to try and change the things that are not so good. And I don't think that many synagogues now, and I don't think CEJA or Federation are frankly interested in getting out of their cone and exposing themselves to criticism by criticizing what are, I mean, frankly, activities in Israel that are contrary to Jewish values. They're contrary to international law. They're contrary to our government policy. So I don't think we're going to convince CEJA or anybody else, but maybe we'll be able to bring the government of Canada along to where JSpace wants to go.
So, and yeah, that's actually a perfect point to jump off from because, look, I don't want to. I and I've evolved on this over time, but I don't really like to spend a whole lot of time worrying about criticizing, bashing other organizations. Part of being fiercely pro-democracy is that all of these organizations have every right to exist. And in fact, part of what makes Canada and the Jewish community in Canada not only beautiful and diverse, but strong and secure, is that there is the freedom for so many of these organizations to exist. And my feeling is let's all go out there and do the best job that we can, and may the best man or woman or person win. And I have to say, like, maybe this is just my ego talking, but like, we are actually, our voices are the ones that are winning right now. Like, if you, and I don't want to say too much about what I hear when I'm on the Hill or whatnot, but we do government advocacy as well. And I'm having conversations with MPs as well. Now, look, had the Conservatives won the projected supermajority of the House that that we thought they were going to win up until, Carney and the Liberals turned it around, I think we'd be singing a much different tune. But right now, while, Jon believes that the Canadian government should be doing much more, and I believe that the Canadian government should be doing more, maybe not as much as Jon wants, but still should be doing more. In fact, the positions of the Canadian government are far more aligned with JSpaceCanada than they are with CEJA. And like, if you read some of the statements coming out from Global Affairs, from Carney, from the government overall, joint statements, etc., the amount of times that people have sent them to me and been like, did JSpace write this? Because it's the same kind of language that we're using in terms of two states and the rights for Jews and Palestinians and criticizing Hamas, but also criticizing the Netanyahu government. And I would say that when I'm in conversations with MPs, what they are asking for, and I think that this is a really good thing to kind of talk about what we can all do, is that what they say to me all the time is like, the things that you are coming to me with, when I come to them with a policy paper, when I come to them with a policy request, they are saying to me, yes, these are the things that we want to do. Where are the rest of your people asking for this? And my one thing that I would love to see from our progressive community is that we spend a lot less time being mad at CJA or being mad at our rabbi or being mad at the Federation, and instead actually mobilize ourselves. And that's why we, offer petitions and we want people to speak up. But really, you calling your MP and saying, like, I am a Jew in your riding, and we don't all believe what CJA says or what B'nai B'rith says, it does so much. It actually really, they are desperate. They are hungry to hear voices because they know that CJA isn't the only voice, but they don't always hear who the other voices are. So like, please, focus your efforts. If you are frustrated at some of our more right-wing organizations, focus your efforts more on presenting an alternative to your member of parliament, to the foreign affairs minister, etc. And I would also note too, like CJA does have an outside, and not just CJA, but like some of the more establishment organizations, they do, when there's articles about anti-Semitism and things that are happening domestically, they do have much more of a voice in those pieces because domestic anti-Semitism just isn't an issue at present that JSpaceCanada deals with. We just don't have the capacity or the governmental connections on that side to be able to deal with those things. So when we get called for comments about anti-Semitism, we just decline the media coverage because it's not our area of expertise. But pay attention when you are reading things about things happening in Israel Palestine. You will see more and more often that voices like JSpace are featured. We share media links all the time. There's been many times where I'll be interviewed by CBC. We know Jon is on TV all the time, kind of bringing up these same talking points in Canadian media. So they actually are really receptive to our voices and want to hear our voices. And if you want our voices to be heard more in media, like same kind of thing, write to CBC. Say, like, I saw John Allen being interviewed. He was awesome. Interview him more. There is so much that everyone else's voices can do. And I think if we shift our focus away from who we're mad at or who we think isn't doing a good job and instead advocate to hear from the people who we think are doing a good job, I think that's going to help a lot more than trying to turn CJA or at someone else just into something that they're not and are never going to be. Let's go to Joey.
Thank you both for that.
Thanks, Donald.
Thanks. I want to pick up on some of the things that Jon has said, but push them quite a bit further. First of all, and you didn't talk specifically about the forthcoming election, but I don't see how we can have any hope in the forthcoming election. The best that we're going to end up with is an inability of either right or left or center left and whatever to form a coalition. Because with the possible exception of the Democrats, and they're equivocating, none of the current opposition parties are prepared to countenance the idea of the Arab parties being in the coalition. Without that, we're going to have, a 50-50 split, and the rest of the Arab parties are 55-55. Netanyahu will have a series of elections, as we did a few years back, through all of which Netanyahu will continue as prime minister, unless, God willing, he's in jail by then. And what we currently see happening on the West Bank will continue to happen over that period, essentially, of non-governance. I start to wonder whether a time is approaching where the progressive position is going to have to start to shift to say the government and public opinion in Israel at the moment has made a two-state solution impossible. And if there's going to be a single state, it's not going to be tolerated as an apartheid state. It's going to be equal political and civil rights across the board. And if Israeli citizens who are not of the hard right, but who uniformly answer in polls that they're opposed to a two-state solution, start to have to think about what the alternatives might be, possibly that creates some movement. And if it doesn't create movement, frankly, I think it is the only progressive position that if there's going to be one state from the river to the sea, everybody has to have equal civil and political and human rights.
Well, let me start, Joey, by saying I'm not quite as pessimistic as you are about the election, although I know a lot of Israelis are scared stiff that Bibi's going to pull it out again. I think Democrat team has made it pretty clear that they are prepared to govern with Arab parties. Secondly, the Arab parties have chosen a joint list, which is hugely important. They, at their best, won 15 seats. That's a lot of seats. We don't know how much Democrat team could win, but it seems to be somewhere between 9 and 14, or who knows what happens when we get to election day. I also think that uh, Yair Lapid, Eisenkot, um, maybe not Lieberman, but others will have second thoughts about whether or not they're prepared to have the Arab parties in their coalition once they realize that if they don't, it's Bibi and Ben Gvir all over again. And the last anti-Bibi coalition, of course, did have an Arab in the coalition. And unfortunately, they didn't have a significant enough majority to stay in power. But with significant seats from the Arabs and with a strengthened left Labor Merits Party, which did so badly in the last election, I continue to hope that they may win. As far as your position was concerned, um, it's kind of scary to even think about it. It's something that may well happen down the line, but I'm afraid that Israel is not going to give up its hold over Israel within the Green Line and its hold over the West Bank and parts of Gaza, depending on what has happened there, very easily. So eventually, maybe you'll end up with one state, but I can't see Israel with the largest army in the Middle East and nuclear weapons, um, doing it in our lifetimes or for a while. It's yes, they'll become a pariah perhaps, and who knows what Western governments will do if they take over and really govern as apartheid state and admit that that's what they are. I don't know what Western governments would do, but I don't think Israel is going to give up, and that's going to be an extremely difficult situation for Israelis, for diaspora Jews who are going to have to take decisions about how they feel, and most importantly, and I keep emphasizing this, our children. Our children are becoming disillusioned with the Israel that they are seeing in the papers. And while we continue to have real conflicts about whether we should criticize and how we should criticize and how far we should go, our kids aren't having those conversations. They're just tuning out. And that's very unfortunate.
Um, So I'm just gonna add, and yes, Joey, thanks for really taking it down for us for that last for our last question because we are coming to time, and I think we want to say a couple of things on closing. But this has been such an enjoyable conversation, and I feel like we could keep talking for hours. And in fact, you and I will be talking again this evening, so we will keep talking for hours. But you know the one thing. So to build on what John is saying, I do think first of all that like. If we think that it's hard to advocate for a two-state solution, and we think that it's hard for the progressive position to be a two-state solution, it will be a million times harder to advocate for a one state with equal rights, given, as John said, like just that enormous inequality that exists between Israel and the Palestinians. So we do have to kind of see the situation as it is. I think, and I've always said this, and this is like I have no problem, saying this that um, one binational state with equal rights is like it's a beautiful vision. That sounds amazing. That sounds utopian. Um, the reality of what would happen if there was one state right now is that it would be a state with extreme racial, ethnic, national inequity, and if we think that outside pressure is that it's really hard for outside pressure to push for a two-state solution, outside pressure to push for equality in that one state would be a million times harder to push for. So we do really have to think not just about what the fantasy is of the thing that we want, but like what the actual situation is on the ground and what has been created over the past 57 or almost 80 years, depending on when you want to kind of start looking at this, and just be really, really honest about what that is. The other thing that I think is that actually, I think what the real progressive position is to actually listen a little bit more to Israelis, because you are right that when you ask Israelis if they support a two-state solution, the numbers are depressingly low. But when you ask Israelis if they support a regional normalization agreement that includes a state of Palestine, the numbers are consistently in about the 60%. So you can look at, I know that um, uh, Accord polls this question regularly. Ron Gerlitz, the CEO of Accord, spoke at our conference this past year. You can hear him talk about it on our YouTube channel. And I know Mitvim, who does foreign policy, Israeli Institute for Foreign Policy, they're a think tank, and one of their speakers spoke 2 years ago as well. They also asked this question very frequently and found the same thing. And so I think the question isn't one state or two states. The question is, when we talk about two states, what is the bias and what's the baggage that people are bringing to it? And is it really about two states, or is it about that word and that language? And what we find is that it is the latter, because again, when you ask about regional normalization agreement that includes recognition of a Palestinian state, Israelis are like, oh yes, that is actually the thing that we want. And there's the things that we have to push for within our Canadian Jewish community and the way that we will talk about things within our Canadian Jewish community. But part of being a progressive and part of striving for equality and tolerance of all is being able to understand and hold empathy for other positions as well. And one of them is the Israeli position, which like has fear around language of two states, but does not seemingly have that same fear around language of regional normalization. So, it could just be as simple as talking about the issue differently. And we see that that's what Yair Golan is trying to do. There's a lot of critique, and I have some as well, of Golan in the diaspora, of him, not being bold enough on these issues. But he recognizes very well that he's speaking to an Israeli audience. And when he talks about, he does, like, people get upset because he doesn't say two-state solution. But he says clear delineated borders with a state of Palestine and a state of Israel. So, like, okay, he's not using the term, but he knows who he's speaking to, and he's trying to find the language to best bring them around. And I think that we should really support that, because end of the day, it is still going to be about Israelis and Palestinians making this work. It's not going to be about Canadians or Americans or anyone else making it work for them, which I would say is actually a pretty is kind of the antithesis of a progressive position. So I share your concerns about the election, but I also share John's opinion as to where that may go. And I differ with you a little bit in terms of not necessarily what's going to happen, but how we approach it if and when it does happen. But I really appreciate the question, and really appreciate this discussion. We are at the end. We're at 4 o'clock already. But John, did you have any final thoughts, or do you want to bring up like a whole new can of worms? Do you want to start talking about Iran? No?
No,
Okay.
no. Next week.
All right. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. I hope we got to all the questions. If we didn't, info@jspacecanada.ca is the best way to send us an email. And please do continue to engage with us on these topics and continue to listen to our policy chats. And if you have suggestions, or if there's like other speakers besides the two of us, or if you'd like to hear us in conversation with another speaker, we'd love to hear it. It was really nice. It was nice to do this with a group of people.
Great.
Yeah.